We're now going to talk about how the national trends we're seeing in youth sports are playing out in local communities. The pandemic created health and financial concerns for many families and youth-serving organizations. Subsequent killings of Blacks by police led to protests around the country and calls for greater equity in society's leading institutions, including sports. Communities around the country face a historic challenge to recover during this unprecedented time. We're going to discuss these challenges and how communities are reacting with 3 local leaders. We're pleased to have Ron Nirenberg, who is mayor of San Antonio. One of his initiatives is the Mayor's Fitness Council and its Student Ambassador Program, which was recognized as a Project Play champion. The program empowers student leaders in grades 5 through 12 to serve as healthy change agents in their schools and communities and learn about nutrition, physical fitness, and mental wellness. Next, we have RaShauna Hamilton, Senior Director of Community Relations and Youth Programs for the Miami Dolphins. During the pandemic, the Dolphins have invested around $3 million in a food relief program over the next year with 1,000 meals served per week. They've also provided exercise equipment to youth and have pivoted to some virtual programming for youth football players. And finally, we have Gabe Albornoz, a council member in Montgomery County, Maryland, and the county's former Recreation Department Director. In September, Montgomery County approved $1.55 million to help address the disparities faced in youth sports participation among underserved youth and low-income families. So thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. We know these are incredibly challenging times, so I want to start by going around to each of you with this question. And Ron, you can start first. What are the biggest concerns you have right now in getting your community kids to be physically active and playing sports again?
Well, thank you. And certainly we have challenges with regard to youth access and youth fitness and wellness in general in San Antonio, which is what the Mayor's Fitness Council was all about. And it's been a program we've had for a number of years now. But the pandemic has really hampered our ability to get programmatic elements out into the community. Because essentially all of our free programs starting in March stopped, and they've been halted for about 6 months now. Whereas 2020 was looking to be one of our best years ever with regard to youth fitness activities and overall youth sport participation, it's basically come to a standstill. However, there are some bright spots. San Antonio has grown its park space and creekways, greenway trails, that sort of thing for a number of years now. And while we saw the decline in youth activity in programs and organized activities, we did see an increase in our park usage, park participation. So there are some bright spots, but clearly we lost our momentum during the pandemic, and we have to work doubly hard to get it back.
Yeah, RaShauna, what are your biggest concerns right now in your community?
I think the biggest challenge that we're having in the Miami community is not unique to us. I think it's a challenge that we're going to face across our country, and it's really how do you feel safe again letting your kid participate in sports, especially in a sport like football where they're on the field with a bunch of other kids, and there's not really an option for 6 feet of space when you're playing a contact sport, if you will, be it flag or tackle football. So I think it's really about how do we safely get back to play, and so we've tried to address that. We also felt like a major challenge was what happens when a family is struggling to feed their kids, right? You've got to be fueled to be able to play. And so that's where our commitment through our foundation for our food relief program came in, because we said, let's start with feeding and let's start with getting food in some homes. And then let's address the exercise and activity component since kids are home. So that's really what I feel the challenge is and how we're trying to help address that challenge.
Great. And Gabe, what are the challenges in Montgomery County?
Well, thank you. I very much echo the concerns raised in the respective communities in Miami and in San Antonio. We're experiencing a lot of that here in Montgomery County. I think we're very concerned about the social and emotional well-being of our children and youth right now. We are all virtual, and kids are not able to exercise in the way that they were before. They're not able to socialize in the way that they were before. And there were challenges prior to the pandemic with youth being able to access different leagues and programs and services depending on what zip code you live in Montgomery County. And those handful of organizations that go above and beyond to be able to provide that support structure for kids and communities that just don't have that same access are crumbling right now. And so my concern is that post-pandemic, those organizations that were trying to stand up programs and services where they are severely lacking are not going to be able to survive. So it's going to compound the challenge of the social and emotional well-being of our children and them not having the same level of opportunities post-pandemic that they had prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, I think the mental well-being is a huge challenge. And Ron, I mean, your office shared some information to us about that in San Antonio, the YMCA youth sports participation for the fall is down 60% for participants compared to last year in 2019. What are you finding? What are you hearing about mental health challenges and the social emotional development of kids during this time there?
I think Gabe said it absolutely right. The reports of anxiety, depression among youth have skyrocketed almost fourfold since the pandemic began compared with times at the same time last year. We know that there's clearly a impact of the social isolation that families and children in particular are going through. And without the fitness outlets that they used to have, that anxiety increases. So we clearly have to figure out ways to cope in the pandemic itself. But with regard to outlets for youth in particular, this is going to be a challenge. If we don't address it, it will compound year after year.
RaShauna, there was a period where South Florida was really hit hard with COVID-19. What is the comfort level now for families there to return to youth sports, and especially tackle football, which is such a popular sport in South Florida?
So I think that parents are really trying to find what the new normal is going to be and how to get their kid back into that new normal. So we know of communities here that have finally started playing again. We know of a couple leagues here that are getting up and running. And so they are all kind of figuring out their new protocols, how to get the kids back safely. We know of a couple communities here where the economic need is very high. And so when they were running programs, that was also helping when your parent's an essential worker, right? There's somewhere for these kids to go that the parent feels safe when they know they have to go to work. And so what they did was they really focused on training programs where you can stay 6 feet apart, you can still interact with other kids, you can go out and maybe work on things like footwork and speed and agility, and that doesn't necessarily require you having that contact. So I think that parents are kind of finding what that new normal is, especially in an area that was a hot spot, a couple of months ago, and they're figuring out how to work through that.
Yeah, and Gabe, Montgomery County, I know, has been one of the more cautious communities in the Washington, D.C. region to reopen. What's the reaction been like from parents in your county about allowing their child to return to sports? And does it vary depending on the competitive level, say travel and club sports versus rec sports?
So it does vary, and it's been extraordinarily challenging because the level of community spread varies from county to county and from city to city. And so here in our area, we're often referred to as the DMV, District, Maryland, and Virginia. And you have different policies that have been established within each jurisdiction. And so travel teams, for example, may have to abide by a certain set of rules in one jurisdiction, but not the same set of rules in others. And it is creating some confusion and frustration. Here in Montgomery County, our public health officials have, as you said, and I think appropriately, taken a more conservative approach to phasing in the reopening of various sports. And they have tiered different sports into different categories, tiers 1, 2, and 3, depending on their impact and how often there's interaction during the game of play. And there has been some debate as to what's in the second degree versus what's in the third degree. And we are requiring in the county, for example, soccer, that up until recently, players had to wear masks while playing. And so there were some travel teams that were refusing to play games here in Montgomery County for that reason. And we've since alleviated that because I think there's been more analysis done of concerns of wearing masks while during play also leads to challenges, respiratory issues. But there is a difference between recreational leagues and travel leagues, where recreational leagues having to wear a mask or taking additional precautions is seen tremendously as an asset, more favorable to some of those families, where other families who are investing a lot of time, energy, and frankly, resources, and are little less concerned. And so it does pose some challenges to establish a policy that everybody can sign on to.
Ron, speaking of travel sports, we know that these travel sports tournaments can be a huge economic driver for local tourism. What's been the impact for the city of San Antonio on the sports ecosystem basically shutting down for many months? You had no amateur sports events, you had no youth travel sports events, you had no San Antonio Spurs, which went into the bubble for quite a bit. What did that look like financially for your city?
Well, it was very difficult, obviously. San Antonio, beyond being an NBA city, is also a city that has a lot of major sporting events every year. We had the Final Four just a couple of years ago. We're anticipating having the women's Final Four coming up this year, and so we are a destination city. We've got an Alamo Bowl, one of the top tier bowl games in college football. So we also have things like USA Diving Championships, a lot of swimming events that take place in our venues. So the impact of a shutdown, essentially, in the sports landscape, amateur, collegiate, and professional, was significant. And based on the direct economic impact of the events I just mentioned, in addition to what we were really anticipating, which is the Defense Department's Warrior Games this year, we had a loss of about $35 million in direct economic impact, not to mention the obviously indirect impacts that it has from visitors and travel, et cetera. And then you have, of course, the shutdown of the NBA season, which was a pretty big hit to our ecosystem as well. The cost of losing essentially a half a season or more of the Spurs was about $25 million as well to the city.
So what does that mean for budgets, say for, recreation? I mean, does that trickle down as well in terms of what you spend moving forward on, Parks and Rec or some of those entities?
Well, it does and it doesn't. So the city of San Antonio's general fund obviously has the Parks and Recreation budget. And one of the things, the lessons learned for municipalities coming out of the pandemic is that we have to do a lot more with regard to health infrastructure. And so, as I mentioned, our parks and rec infrastructure and programming has to be maintained or increased. And one of the things that we found, one of the best outlets for folks during this pandemic has been our trails, our hike and bike trails. We've got an elaborate system around the city. It was one of those places that we can keep open despite the rules around congregating, because the trails are meant for people to keep moving and not congregate. So those were, we saw a twofold increase, literally from 75,000 people in a 6-month period last year to about 150,000 people this year. So people were utilizing them. And I think it's a lesson learned for us that we've got to continue to resource our health infrastructure, and that includes sporting events.
Gabe, I want to turn to you a little bit about Montgomery County and the initiative that you all are doing, because you did something that's, I think, very rare during this pandemic. Is the council committed a significant amount of money, $1.55 million, to help underserved youth access recreational sports. I know in advance of the funding, the county produced a very detailed, very thoughtful report that concluded that youth sports are not well aligned with the needs of many families. What key disparities did you find, and what did you see the value of intentionally focusing on underserved areas?
So our Office of Legislative Oversight, which is the think tank arm of the legislative branch of our local government, did a phenomenal analysis of youth sports participation in the county and confirmed what we had known anecdotally, which is that there are defined sports deserts in the county. There are entire zip codes that have significantly less percentage of youth playing than more affluent zip codes. And they found the reasons, number one is cost, accessing the sport itself. Number two was struggling to find parents who had the time to be able to volunteer to coach. And in communities where families are having to work multiple jobs for many hours, often unusual hours, it's hard to find parents to coach. The cost of equipment was also a huge barrier. And then the fourth significant barrier was transportation, physically being able to get kids to and from practices and of course games. Entire communities not have the same access is a problem on a lot of different levels. And so the council has stood up funding to be able to address those sports deserts and create leagues if we need to, recruit and yes, pay for coaches if we can't find volunteers, help minimize the costs of accessing those sports and providing transportation where we need to be able to eliminate all of those barriers to youth sports participation. This has received unanimous support of the entire council and our county executive. And we all recognize now, as we said at the beginning of this discussion, that these investments in particular are critical today. Because of the social and emotional well-being of our youth, we do view this as an investment. And we're hoping that the infrastructure that we set up through this initiative will have us be stronger coming out of this on the other side of the pandemic, and hopefully identify new leagues and coaches that we can get going when we're able to move forward.
Yeah, it's a really phenomenal initiative, but how do you ensure the right investments happen to help the underserved communities, right? And so it doesn't just go to the people who can afford it.
That's a good question. So as you mentioned, I used to be the director of the recreation department, and we have over 27 recreation centers in every corner of Montgomery County. And those center directors really know their communities well. And so starting with those zip codes where we have those sports deserts is identifying folks that know their communities well, people like our recreation professionals, our parks professionals. We also have a unique entity in the county called the Community Use for Public Facilities. They broker the space. They serve as the middle person to help leagues and teams access fields and gyms and other sports and recreational spaces in the county. They also have a very strong understanding of the community. And so we're also going to form a task force coming out of this that we think will transition to what will be called a sports commission, so that there's an entity focused on this that really understands these communities and helps ensure the longevity of initiatives like this.
I think everybody's hurting financially, right? Not just the municipalities, but we know that pro sports teams are hurting. And I wonder, we often hear municipalities that parks and recreation can be one of the first to be cut. Is that true of pro sports community dollars as well? Will the Dolphins have to cut funding for youth programming?
So like you said, we are not immune to the challenges that are going on. And so that's where we had to think about the resources that we have, our philanthropic resources to be specific, our foundation dollars. Where are they going? Should we be focused in other areas than we currently are? And so that's where we had to make some tough choices, where historically we've been able to provide some funding for youth sports. We had to shift some of that funding to help feed. Right. So there's no way to get to a $3 million program and not figure out how to reallocate some of those funds. And so we did have to shift a little bit of that money. But, because the municipalities and the leagues weren't playing, luckily, right, they weren't hurting for those dollars. So we tried to find some other ways to support them. And so that's where we came with one of our healthcare partners, Baptist Health, and worked to create a program where we'll be able to donate football equipment and exercise equipment to some student athletes. So we're trying to find ways to be able to still support the youth sports community just in general, because we think that it's important. And for those youth athletes that we're supporting with those fit kids, they're not just football players. We're hoping that they are not specializing in just football. So we made sure that our fit kits included things like jump ropes and cones and stretch bands. So it's not just a football in a kid's hand for us. It's what else can they be doing to better their mental health by moving their body around. And if it's only them because they're not going to be able to throw the football to somebody else for a while, how else can they stay active?
Interesting. And so how does that equipment sharing program work? Is it like combined with the food relief program, or is it
So
separate?
it is. So pretty much everything we've done out in the community now includes some aspect of feeding. So we are working with our school districts. So we work very closely with both Broward County and Miami-Dade County schools to find some schools that are in need, that are in some areas that they just have more need than maybe others at this particular moment. And so they've identified a few schools. We've also worked with a couple of Palm Beach County schools, which is a little bit north of us. And we've figured out which schools to go to and targeted some student athletes that we feel are in need. And we're going to go and drop off some fit kits for them individually, but then also drop off a meal. So I'm sure that both my other two panelists know that, especially in the school system, right, if you're on free or reduced lunch program and there's no school and you're virtual, you may not be eating as an athlete. So that's why we thought it was important to not just include the fit kit, but to also include the food.
Yeah. And RaShauna, are you nervous about what the future may look like for these youth sports organizations if they're not getting as much programming dollars from you, if they're not getting it from the municipalities? Where are they getting from? Do you worry some of these may not survive?
I do. I think that's a reality of our world today, right? It's just like nonprofit organizations. I think funding is going to be a very big question for everybody, especially for programs that are in a state like Florida, who thrives heavily on our tourism here. And so I think that there is a little bit of nerves for them, but I also think it's an opportunity, because I think that free play will come back a little bit more, which I know that Project Play has talked a lot about. I think that kids are kind of going to realize now there's more opportunity for free play, so they can go into the municipalities like my other two panelists are working in, and they can use parks and open spaces. And now they're going out with kids in their neighborhood. You know, they're not necessarily waiting for their travel team or their club team to go and play. They're saying, hey, if that's not an option, and parents are saying, hey, you still need to get out and do something, let's go down to the park and let's go toss the football, just me and my parent or my guardian, and let's figure out how we can still be active, even though it might not be through organized sport.
Yeah. So look, it's not only COVID-19 that America, of course, is wrestling with right now. We're also coming to grips with a lot of longstanding racial injustices within our institutions. Sports is, not immune from that. I'm interested in hearing from each of you. Ron, maybe you want to go first on this, about in what ways, if any, do racial inequities appear in youth sports in your community? And what do you think can be done to address that?
Yeah, well, this is obviously a critical area for us to address as a community, and I think exposes a lot of the inequities we have up and down of our systems. Racial inequity in sports for San Antonio has everything to do with access, and it's critically linked with all of our other societal issues, including poverty, health disparity, et cetera. So what we've found is, in order for us to address this, we've created an equity framework basically in all the operations of our city. San Antonio is one of a few cities, certainly here in Texas, but also nationwide, to have an Office of Equity. We do all of our resource planning, accounting for the historical disparities that have occurred in our community that now manifest themselves, and in some cases, life expectancy differences from one census tract to another. So as we go about allocating resources, whether it's dollars for a youth sports program or it's building out a trail system, what we're doing is focusing on how we can redress those disparities based on the historic inequities that existed. With regard to how we measure success, it's about over time ensuring that those health measures begin to change. But the work is comprehensive, and it's not just about youth sports. And how we measure success is on outcomes, whether or not the child poverty rate decreases, whether or not the obesity and diabetes rates decreases. And the disparities that are most significant are those zip codes that correlate to high poverty areas, areas with lower access to education and economic mobility. So everything we're doing is to attack those inequities. And one of the measures of that is racial injustice, the inequities that have been built based on long ago laws that were long since ruled unconstitutional. We have to continue to address those inequities that have been created as a result.
Yeah. Gabe, how about in Montgomery County? What racial inequities do you see in relation to youth sports or physical activity?
So that was music to my ears. We just recently passed a very similar racial inequity framework here in Montgomery County. So from a budget lens, from a policy lens, we're taking a moment to see how this will, whatever we do will impact various communities. And so sports it was easier for us to be able to move forward these funds during this difficult time, because when you look at sports through that lens, it does very clearly show that those communities that have more resources, have more recreational activities, have more organized youth sports. And what we have found, particularly in the sports sector, is there's a missing middle. You go from zero to elite and club with almost nothing in the middle, and that's exasperated in communities that can't afford and have those challenges and barriers I mentioned earlier to be able to access sports. And this is a profound problem because those inequities, will proliferate these children's lives if they don't have access to the same quality programming that benefited probably everybody on this panel, and they don't have those same opportunities, then it will impact their lives. And so it's incumbent upon our community and our public sector to help fill in those holes through those public-private partnerships, because if we don't, it's going to have a long-lasting negative impact.
Yeah, and we've seen in national data for kids ages 6 to 12, sports participation is higher for white youth than it is for people of color, than it is for Blacks, and it is for Hispanics. RaShauna, what do you see in South Florida with racial inequities?
So I think we have the same issues and the same challenges. I think that in South Florida, there is a gap. I think that we're trying to work to fill from where we sit as a professional sports team. And I think the thing that we've really tried to do is we have a program called our Football Unites program, and it does exactly that. So we truly believe that sports can be a catalyst for change, for changing perspectives, for changing hearts, for changing minds. And so that's really what we're trying to do, is focus on how do the inequities that we see in sport, how can we try to get everybody to an equal playing field at some point, right? Like that's the long-term goal for all of us. And so through our Football Unites program, we've brought together about 60 organizations that represent different segments and categories within our market. So there's areas that talk about identity and LGBT youth, and there's also segments like Special Olympics where we talk about ability, but there's also faith as part of that as well, and gender. And so we bring all of these organizations together and we provide programming for those organizations so that the first step can at least be knowledge. So we believe that education is really the first step to tearing down some of those walls of inequities, and that's what we're doing through football. So we bring youth from all these different segments and we toss them all together. We put them in one big group and we say, you may have came with your group from Special Olympics, but you're going to leave here talking and interacting with kids from 2 other organizations, and you're going to play football next to them and you're going to talk to them.
So last question for each of you. I want to try to end on a hopeful note, even though these are very challenging times. 1 year from now, hopefully we'll all be in a much better place as a society handling this virus. Assuming that's the case, in your mind, what would at least the start of a successful recovery for youth sports in your community look like to you? And Ron, do you want to take the first shot at that?
Sure. Well, I think that not every crisis needs to, let me just say, I think that what we have realized as a country, but certainly here in our local communities, is that the pandemic has laid bare a lot of the issues that we were living with and that communities around the country have been struggling with. To me, that's a very powerful thing. When you have the attention of the entire country on the vast inequities that have led to the catastrophic economic condition that so many families are finding themselves in. It's all built on a series of inequities that have been long unaddressed in our community. So I think that what I'm excited about, particularly with sporting events and youth activities and our investment in them is that we will begin to see a much more deliberate approach of bringing these kinds of activities into the communities that have been suffering without them because of the tangible impacts on wellness, health, and all of the other later in life benefits that you get from health and fitness activities. When we don't address health disparity as a root cause for all the other issues that one would experience in life, we just produce the results that we had been dealing with long before this pandemic. So I think that as a result of the clarity we've received through this pandemic, we will be able to focus on these inequities, and in particular, youth sports will be directed at communities that will have great benefit from them going forward.
Great. RaShauna, what do you hope youth sports in your community looks like a year from now?
I hope it looks like kids getting out and playing in some of that free space time. You know, I think that while organized sports is great and kids should continue to play organized sports where it's available to them, I think, you know, I hope that we are a year from now, we are in a place where kids feel comfortable going to their local park and playing, where kids are getting out and they're consuming sports, you know, in just any way that they can. And I hope that it's allowing them to connect with other kids in their communities. And honestly, communities adjacent to theirs, because as we know, you can go in the zip code right next to yours and you can experience something completely different from your own. So I'm really hoping that a year from now we have kids in Miami and Broward County and Palm Beach County that can honestly get out, they can play, they can meet other kids, and they can expand their worlds a little bit outside of their computer screens.
Great. Gabe, you'll have the last word. Give us paint an optimistic picture somehow, hopefully, of a year from now. What looks good for youth sports in Montgomery County?
I am actually optimistic about our future. I truly am. This has forced us to look in the mirror in so many different ways. And those disparities that existed are now on steroids, but it's forcing us to look at creative solutions. And so I'll talk about this in two categories. One, I do hope that we identify that missing middle. We set up recreation leagues and programs and services in areas that deserve them, that need them. And that's a hole that we're going to try to fill through county resources and through public-private partnerships. But I also hope that families take a step back and reflect on this time where they're home for dinner more often, where they're not rushing around from league to league, from game to game, having their 9-year-old go to tournaments across the country. I think we need to really look back at the sports climate and environment and reflect on what's the most important. And that's our families, that's our health, that's our wellness. And, you know, we spend $60,000 over the lifespan of a sports, hoping for a $10,000 scholarship to some of our colleges. I think we need to put that in perspective and have youth focus on what's important, and that's playing and having a good time and hanging out with their friends. So I think we're going to come out of this stronger, and I so appreciated joining this panel with you guys.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much. We really appreciate you joining the conversation. We wish you and everyone in your community the best, and we are hopeful for a brighter future moving forward.